joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning, leaning, I'm leaning on the everlasting arms.
The book of James gives us clear directives. The scriptures make it all very plain. James tells us, are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. So if you ever thought that Christian faith was about believing the right things, then all you have to do is to read the book of James to find out just how very mistaken you really were. You see, Christian faith is not solely about believing the right things. Christian faith is about being a certain kind of people. So to read into the short book of James at one sitting is to discover that a Christian community does many things, not just solely believe things, but actively pursues things. James tells us the church endures suffering. The church gives generously. The church is quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. The church bridles its tongue. The church cares for widows and orphans. The church shows as much care for the poor as for the rich. The church avoids foul language and swearing. The church is peaceful and practices humility. The church does not boast. The church says no evil against one another. The church avoids all forms of corruption. The church is patient. And the church does not grumble. And then we come to the last verses of the book, the ones which I wish to address for us today. What else do the scriptures tell us? What else does a community of Christians do? The Bible makes it plain. The Bible tells us when suffering, they pray. When cheerful, they sing. When sick, they ask the church elders to pray over them and to anoint them with oil. Do you hear what's being said? James knows that following Christ is not something that comes naturally or easily to us. Following Christ is a discipline that takes practice. James knows that we become what we practice, and that if we wish to be disciples of Jesus, that we will need to live with others who practice Jesus' disciplined way. James is church building here. He is building the church not by knocking on doors, or putting out a welcome sign, or by holding a rummage sale. He is building the church by asking, no, strike that, by demanding even that we be disciplined enough together to act as Christians. We are, you see, training to be the people God intends us to be. We are apprentices of faith, Christians in the making. And James is our trainer, pointing us to the disciplines which will get us there, badgering us when we fall short or we find excuses. Because, let's face it, it is not easy being the people of God in this world. Listen again. Are any among you suffering, he says? They should pray. James teaches us that in the Christian community, The first response to suffering is prayer, not because prayer will solve everything, but because that is who we are, that is the discipline we practice, that is how we follow Christ. Through prayer, we are formed into a people who always trust that suffering can be overcome and who know that finally suffering is beyond our control and recovery is in God's hands. James also continues, "Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise." Praising God with voices united humbles us. It shapes us into a people who know in our bones that it is ultimately God who has the power and who is in control and who deserves all of our praise. James continues, "Are any among you sick?" He says, "Look what James would have us do when one of our number becomes ill." Listen carefully. Be mindful of what he says. He would have the elders of the church pray over them and anoint them with oil, no less. That sounds like a little old-fashioned to me, if you ask me. But like prayers and praise, anointing is an act of surrender and submission. Only God knows every bit about us, and only God knows our fate when injury or disease threaten to steal away our loved ones. So in desperate times such as these, we long for a miracle. We long for deliverance. Surely medicine is a miracle, but there are limits to what mere mortals can do. There are limits. We are finite, while God is infinite. So after that, we turn to God who has no limits. Anointing acknowledges that some healing is solely in the hands of our Creator. So there you have it. James is certainly demanding, ordering us with tall orders, insisting we live out our faith in specific ways, only we're not accustomed to do much of that. To be honest, we aren't in the habit of this kind of prayer and praises. And since we're talking about medicine, anointing, we're not used to it. True, we could tinker with our prayer and praise. No harm in praying longer and singing louder. But we largely relegate anointing to ancient superstitions and old-time religious revivals. But many long for an anointing. Those with COVID-19 or any life-threatening ailment would gladly welcome prayer and anointing if they had the means to spare them from disease or even death. Of course, there are no certainties in terms of health, even if the prayers are earnest and the anointings are sincere. And those in the front lines of medicine know that unpredictability all too well. Even the healthy sometimes die, the young can suffer, and the infirm can oftentimes recover. So I invite Lisa Jarnigan to share what she's encountered in the front lines of medicine, especially as we mourn the deaths of more than 200,000 Americans who have died from COVID-19. I hope you stay tuned. Hi, this is Pastor Don Shipley. I'm just really delighted to have a conversation with Lisa Jarnigan, who's a doctor and a dear friend. So Lisa, could you please introduce yourself to us, please?
Of course. I'm Lisa Jarnigan. I am a pulmonary and critical care fellow down in Phoenix, which just means that I've gone through, we were just counting about 12 years of schooling to be where I'm at. But I am currently working in the hospitals and COVID units, which is why Dawn asked me to talk with you today.
Yeah. So tell us, you spent quite a bit of time in the COVID units. How long? And
I did. Essentially it's from the start, actually. So we started getting cases here in March, and then we had a big surge of cases in July. And so up until actually really this week, I was in COVID units throughout that whole time in different forms, either in the ICU or taking care of patients in non-ICU patients with COVID as well.
what was the nature, the climate, of the circumstances that you were working in? Conditions were pretty grim, I imagine, in places, but describe what the situation was like for you.
For Phoenix, we were lucky in that we had all the protective equipment we needed, and we felt very lucky in that regard, because I know there are places in the country that didn't have that support. But it was busy, especially in July when we had our surge. We had to open up 4 extra ICUs, which for perspective, we have 2 ICUs in our hospital anyway, so we essentially tripled our workload. without tripling our staff
How
necessarily.
many patients would that be approximately?
We had in our ICU alone, we had 100 patients, about 100 patients.
And then you also had people in CCU, right? Or does that?
Yeah, and we had kind of overflowed. So we have medical ICUs, and we had overflowed into our cardiac ICUs, our neuro ICUs, and some of our old ICUs that had actually not been running for a few years, they opened up again as just kind of extra beds. And then in our medical floors, our hospital is about a 700 bed hospital, and we had at least 500, a lot of about 500 beds with either COVID or COVID rule out patients.
I can't imagine how demanding that was. Can you tell us what it was like?
Um, it was busy, but there was a lot of camaraderie, I have to say. It was, especially in the COVID units themselves, it was the same nurses that were working and the same staff kind of going in every day. And so you got to know each other really well, and it was a stressful experience, but there was just a lot of camaraderie, which was a good thing.
Well, indeed. Now, on the other side, the patients and families, how are they holding up?
It was incredibly hard for them, particularly for families. They, as it is in most cases, family members weren't allowed to visit, and so we updated the families every day. But it's hard when you only have a 10-minute conversation with the doctor or the nurse, and you're not getting to see your family member, and you're not understanding what they're going through
Right.
in the hospital.
So, given the isolation for the patients, some of course were probably unconscious and sedated, but for those of them who were alert and awake, how did you go about giving them comfort with the absence of their families?
The alert and awake, the nurses actually were amazing at FaceTiming a lot. They would bring in their personal phones, or we even had iPads. We had limited iPads, which is why it ended up being personal phones, calling family members quite a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
But for instance, one young woman who was in the hospital with us for about, I think at the end it was about 3 months, about 6 weeks into it, was really having a hard time, and was actually getting a lot of confusion. And so one of the things we find in general is reminding people of their family kind of helps with that. So I had the family members send me pictures of her, and we printed them out and put them all over her room to try and remind her of who her family was, who she was fighting for to get home to.
Yeah, it sounds like they could just get a bit untethered over time.
Absolutely. It's a very good way of describing it.
What about chaplains? Did they serve a function in this situation? Were they allowed to circulate and offer support, or?
They were allowed to circulate. We don't have many in our hospital, and so it was limited what they could do. But no, they did circulate, and they were helpful for the family members and patients that needed that help.
Mm-hmm. So we know the mortality statistics now. Approximately more than 200,000 Americans have died, more than that now. And certainly you also had to encounter quite a bit of death during the course of your time there. What was that like? And how did you find strength to sort all that out?
So in my profession, because I am in critical care, death is not something new to me. But I will have to say that it was hard being around patients that were so much closer to my age, or so much closer to my experiences, my parents, that sort of,
Sure.
able to relate to them much more than usual. How I found strength was just sort of hoping that there would be an end. Honestly, was just hoping that, doing what you could for people. And if it were me, if it were my family member, what would I want them to be done? And that included a lot more of the social aspect than usual. It was not only the medicine, but it was, talking to them longer than, as physicians are known for. We don't spend much time in rooms. So it was,
Right.
we took a conscious effort to really connect more with these patients as best we could.
Trying to provide and foster that sort of human interface.
Exactly.
Now, I'm talking about all the grimmer statistics, but there was some hope. There were people who found recovery and were released from the hospital. So tell us some of those cases.
We, two in particular that were kind of near and dear to my heart. There was the young mother that I talked about. She was a mother of two and was very close to my age, and I had the privilege of taking care of her in the ICU when she was there, and then I had switched rotations just because of the nature of my job, and was on the floor, the medical floor, and she sort of followed me, and so came out of the ICU, and I got to take care of her there. And and help her be discharged, it was really nice to see the someone get better and someone get to
Right.
see the end of it.
Right.
And then similar, there was another young man who was a father of 3 who same thing, just followed me out of the when I went out of the ICU. He followed me um, and got to see him to the end.
Well, that's gratifying, and probably why you're in medicine, is to see those sorts of cases like that.
It is.
Yeah. Now, of course, for many of us, we're fearful of being exposed to COVID or succumbing to it and so on. What kind of advice would you offer folks that are currently healthy, but of course we're seeing a spike in new COVID cases? What would you suggest we do?
Just be cognizant of who you're seeing and how you're seeing them. I think that a lot of people are starting to do family circles, or they're calling them their circles, which I think are great. We can't ignore the fact that we're social creatures and we need people, and we need that for our mental health also. But I think just be cognizant of who it is you're seeing and who they're seeing is the important thing too. I think that it's now that people are more protected, wearing masks and social distancing in public, it's fairly safe to do grocery shopping and that sort of a thing.
Right.
But just wash your hands, have hand gel with you, the same things everyone's saying. Don't touch your face, just try and protect yourself as much as you can.
Yeah. All right. So as we know that there's still debate about mask wearing, but you're probably a big champion of masks, I imagine.
Big champion of masks, yeah.
Indeed. So I'm also wanted to explore a little bit about the field that you're pursuing. I've known you for quite a long time. How does faith, how do you incorporate your faith into your work? And what inspires you to do what you do in regards to your faith?
In regards to my faith, it's, one thing is that this has been a challenging road to get where I am, and you just kind of have to bring back to the initial reason of why, back when you met me before even medical school or at college, for that matter,
Right.
What even got me to here. And it was the people. It was, I wanted to take care of people. I love that human interaction, and I get to have that interaction with people on a very intimate level.
Mm-hmm.
In critical care and pulmonary, for that matter, it's you get to a point with anyone, if that their time on earth per se is ending, and you get to have that relationship with them. And
I think what you're telling me is that they offer you perspective, and that death isn't necessarily to be feared or avoided,
exactly,
but
yes,
can be embraced and understood in that kind of capacity. Is that right?
that is right, yes.
And so that the perspective that they're offering you is one of just understanding that death is an inevitable part of life.
It
right?
is, yes. And having that perspective, I should say, of that it is an inevitable part of life helps me live more fulfilling, helps me help my patients live more fulfilling, of figuring out what's limiting them from the life that the life that they want. If that's being with family, if that's going hiking, if it's you just being able to read a book, or what is it that's limiting them. It's just, it gives me good perspective.
Yeah. That's terrific. One of the things I want to bring back, a subject you brought up a little bit before, about the families that are stuck outside while their loved ones are being treated inside hospitals. What advice can you offer those family members who are distressed and full of anxiety and uncertainty and such? What would make it easier for them to be able to sort of navigate that
I would say
space?
I would invite them and encourage them to call every day. I think it's challenging, particularly in surge situations where there's where we don't have, we're working very hard to take care of family members, but it's call the nurses, ask for updates, but also just, I guess, we ask to have patience and know and trust. And I know that's really hard to do when you're not able to see your family and even talk to them in some instances, but we really are doing the best we can, where we know they're your family members. We're acting like they're our family members to kind of take that role. But it would really just to be advocate and call and get updates as much as possible.
So would there, I mean, a single call every day to the off or to the nurse's station would be helpful, but what about repeated calls? If one calls too frequently, does that really disrupt care for other patients?
I would say every unit is different, and so that's a question to ask the nurses also. Just and not only asking, I would say 2 calls a day is probably the most that people can have capacity for because they're also updating other family members.
Hmm.
Also asking the nursing staff of when is a good time for you to call. Because sometimes there are particular times of the day during shift change or during rounds with the teams that the nurses really and the physicians really want to be having their focus on how to get family member better or the patient better. And so just being open-minded of it might not be a convenient time we need to kind of come up with a convenient time for both parties to make sure we're still doing our primary job of trying to get your family member better.
Right. Hmm. So vaccines seem to be far in the far future. It doesn't look like there'll be any immediately.
Yeah.
What news can you offer us? Any other new insights that you have discovered or your fellow doctors have discovered in regards
I
to treatments and such?
There was just recently a paper published that they are in kind of the initial phases of a vaccine.
Mhm.
There's the problem with vaccine is there's multiple challenges to it. Of one is we first and foremost need to make sure it's safe and
Right.
that people aren't having reactions to it. And the second is that not only is it working, that people are getting a response to it, but then is that response protecting them is the third part. And so there's really there has been a study where a new vaccine is out, has been deemed to be safe, which is good, but they need to answer those next 2 questions of is it effective and is it effective against recurrent COVID?
Gotcha. So meanwhile, we still have to wear masks and wash our hands.
Yes.
Right. Fair enough. Well, Lisa, I really appreciate the conversation. I'm just delighted to have you agreeing to an interview, and I appreciate you enriching the conversation with your insights and perspective and experience. Thank
Of
you very
course.
much. God bless you.
You too. Thank you.